Hello, everyone. This is John Kania, Managing Director at FSG and co-author of the book Do More Than Give. We're excited to welcome you to our webinar, Catalyzing Change, Stories from Bold Donors Who Drive Real Results. Thank you all for joining us. We have three fantastic panelists with us today. Valerie Jacobs, a founding board member of the Jacobs Family Foundation of San Diego, Monique Vila, CEO of the Thomson Reuters Foundation of London, and Paul Bress, President of the William and Flora Hewlett Foundation of San Francisco and co-author of Money Well Spent. They're going to talk about their experiences with Catalytic Philanthropy and share stories of their bold journeys to find solutions to key problems. We have had over, I think, 825 registrants for today's webinar, so that's absolutely outstanding. And we'll be live tweeting today using hashtag DMTG. We hope you'll join us. Next slide, please. First, I want to give a quick introduction about FSG. We're a global nonprofit consulting firm that provides strategy, evaluation, and research services to clients around the world. We were founded in the year 2000, by Harvard professor Michael Porter and Mark Kramer, and we now work across all sectors, foundations, nonprofits, corporations, and governments, to help organizations solve social problems. Next slide, please. So we're looking forward to a good conversation with our panelists today, and we're going to leave time at the end of our presentation for Q&A, question and answer. You can enter your questions at any time by typing your question into the box on the lower left part of your screen. We may not be able to answer all of your questions, but we'll try to address key themes and as many questions as we can. Many of you are already familiar with the concept of catalytic philanthropy from the Stanford Social Innovation Review article we wrote, or from the book Do More Than Give. I'd like to introduce my FSG colleague and co-author, Leslie Crutchfield, who will briefly describe the idea of catalytic philanthropy before we hear from our panelists.
Thanks, John. Thanks so much for everyone for joining the call. Let me begin by sharing with our audience a little bit about why John and Mark Kramer and I wrote Do More Than Give, the 6 practices of donors who change the world, and profile folks like Valerie and Monique and Paul, who we'll hear from later on the call. We wrote the book because we at FSG see that just here in the United States alone, more than $300 billion will be given away annually. And yet, when you consider how far philanthropy is from solving some of the vast and complex problems that we face in our world, from poverty to struggling school systems to climate change, many of the issues that everyone on this webinar is really concerned with, we at FSG have come to believe that philanthropy as it's commonly practiced has got to change. And we believe more donors will need to take a catalytic approach if we're going to reach our full philanthropic potential in this 21st century of giving. Next slide, please. In fact, this is an auspicious time to be talking about how we can maximize philanthropic impact. Modern philanthropy as we know it in the United States is celebrating this year its centennial anniversary. Andrew Carnegie, pictured here on the computer 100 years ago in 1911, incorporated the Carnegie Corporation, and thus introduced the first major general-purpose secular foundation. And until that point, at least in the U.S., we had mainly charity. And the very idea of philanthropy, we introduced that term. The idea was to go beyond ad hoc giving and create a new legal form so that donors could systematically pool their resources in foundations and systematically give them away to solve problems. And this really was the promise of philanthropy. Now, fast forward to 100 years later, and now in 2011, we see a vastly different landscape for donors. First of all, more than 75,000 foundations exist in the U.S. alone, tens of thousands more overseas of all kinds, whether corporate foundations, private foundations, small family operations, as well as community foundations. And more than half of these institutions were founded in the last 2 decades. So there's been this explosion of wealth and vehicles for giving. Meanwhile, we've seen a simultaneous growth in the nonprofit sector. More than 1.5 million operating nonprofits in the United States alone, many of which did not exist before the Civil Rights era, giving donors today more choices than ever. about charities to support. Along with this, we've seen the role of government shift dramatically as well. If you think about it, since 1911, we've seen the advent of the income tax, the New Deal, 2 world wars, the war on poverty in the U.S. The size of the government has grown, both in scope and influence. And as a result, today, the name of the game for donors is how can they leverage government resources, not keep separate their private philanthropy from public good. Indeed, you have Bill Gates talking about how he has to leverage international aid organizations because his billions are just a drop in the bucket compared to some of the problems that he's trying to solve just through his foundation alone. And finally, we see the role of business changing as well. Our co-author, Mark Kramer, and Michael Porter have a new article in Harvard Business Review about creating shared value, about how companies can align their environmental and social objectives along with bottom line objectives, and how we can, we have different expectations of how businesses create shared value today. And we expect more and different things of our companies than we did 100 years ago. As a result of all these shifts, we have a new landscape for donors, many of the foundation leaders on this call at the vanguard of philanthropy in the 21st century. And this creates new opportunities. Next slide, please. For catalytic donors that we write about in our book, the landscape is very different. Catalytic donors on the right side of the graphic that you see themselves as part of a larger system. How can they leverage the 4 sectors of society, government, business, nonprofits, and even individual people, the local residents in the communities that they want to serve? Whereas the common practice of philanthropy looks quite different. On the left-hand side of the image that you see kind of a linear process. The common approach to philanthropy begins with selecting a nonprofit. Then you give a grant. At the end of the year, most donors, trustees get a report. The goal of this whole process is at the end of the day to give away money to very worthy, deserving charities. Whereas the catalytic philanthropists, first of all, their goal is to solve problems. And so they're looking not just to how they can make grants, but how they can leverage each of these sectors in society, each of those gears, if you will, find points of leverage or tipping points, as Malcolm Gladwell might say, to advance causes and actually solve those problems. Why do catalytic philanthropists do things so differently? Next slide. Well, we believe that catalytic donors have a very nuanced understanding of the nature of social and environmental problems. Thank you. The different kinds of problems have different kinds of solutions. But the challenge that we see in philanthropy today is that most donors seem to approach the complex challenges as if they were simple or could be solved with a linear process, like simply making a grant. The authors of a great book we recommend called Getting to Maybe point out that some challenges can be described as simple, right? Baking a cake, you follow a standard recipe, repeat, every time you're going to get cake. Other problems could be described as complicated, like getting a rocket to the moon. It takes incredibly complicated feats of engineering, construction, physics, but if you build the machine just right and you set it on a course to the moon, you can count on gravity to do its part. Whereas social and environmental problems can be described as complex. Use the analogy of trying to raise a child. This little boy here, to me, looks like he's dressed up like Peter Pan, which reminds me of my daughter who wanted to be a Halloween costume, her cheetah costume last year. And we said, fine, you can wear your velvet cheetah costume on Halloween. And then she wanted to be a cheetah the next 60 days. And no, you can't be dressed up as a cheetah every day for school for 2 months straight. Why not? When you try and address the problem, that a child talks back. You can't count on it to behave and respond the same way every time, like gravity. And that's the way social and environmental problems are emergent. They are complex. You have to have an adaptive response. And so catalytic donors understand this, and that's why They employ the 6 practices that we're going to talk about today on the call to adapt and respond to these complex challenges. Next slide, please. I'll give a brief overview of the 6 practices of donors who change the world, and then our panelists are going to tell you from a practitioner perspective how these really play out on the ground. The catalytic approach first begins with committing to your cause. Donors galvanizing around one or a few issues and being very strategic in their approach. Then they employ these 6 practices to varying degrees to solve the problem. Now, the first 4 practices correspond with those 4 sectors of society that I referenced earlier, those 4 gears in a previous slide. First, catalytic donors advocate for change. They don't shy away from partnering with public agencies, supporting advocacy, and even lobbying. There are legal restrictions depending on what type of funder you happen to be, but catalytic donors realize they can't leave aside the vast resources and influence of government if they really want to leverage every force to advance their cause. Practice 2, they blend profit with purpose. They harness market forces, work through the business sector, use corporations to create shared value, leverage their business know-how, and bring that to bear on tackling complex problems. Practice 3, they work and forge nonprofit networks, working both in collaboration with their donor peers, their grantees, the nonprofits, the NGOs they support. We write about this in the book as part of a process called collective impact, which my co-authors John and Mark go more in depth in a recent article in Stanford's Social Innovation Review. Practice 4, Empower the People, is all about how catalytic donors engage with individual residents, people who live in the communities that we're trying to help and serve, not treating them as just a problem or a statistic, but actually part of the solution. And we'll hear more about that from Valerie next. And then the last 2 practices, number 5 and 6, are sort of the internal management or leadership characteristics we observed in all kinds of donors that are catalytic. They lead adaptively, and they learn how to create change, which is really about their approach to evaluation, not retrospectively looking back and trying to figure out whether or not the grant was spent correctly, but looking forward. What can they learn from their grantees and apply that to their strategy so they can adapt and change going forward? So with that, we're now going to turn it over to Valerie and Monique and Paul to tell you from the front lines of how some catalytic donors are achieving real results on the ground.
Great. Thanks so much, Leslie. So Leslie's provided a great foundation for what we mean when we say catalytic philanthropy. And we're now going to hear from 2 very exciting practitioners of catalytic philanthropy. Our next presenter is Valerie Jacobs, founding board member of the Jacobs Family Foundation in San Diego. And the Jacobs Family Foundation is actually one of the catalytic donors that we feature in Do More Than Give. So we're delighted that Valerie could join us today and share a bit of their exciting story of impact in their community. Valerie, thanks for being with us.
Thank you, John. Our journey to catalytic philanthropy began with my father, the original compassionate conservative. The entrepreneurial spirit that drove him to success in business also led him and our family to explore this new form of philanthropy. His economic conservatism, combined with 3 liberal, social justice-minded daughters, led to what we call in our family the big fight. Dad wanted to support conservative causes, but said at the same time we all had equal say. We had to decide whose money was it. So we discussed it, and the conclusion was that it was really all of ours, since it was the money that his daughters would have inherited. So we got to share equally in the decision-making in terms of where this money would go. But we needed to find common ground, something we could all feel passionately about. So we chose to focus our philanthropy in a low-income neighborhood in San Diego and moved into the neighborhood as neighbors so we could do philanthropy side by side with residents. This was not an easy transition. There was, and still is, a lot of distrust of our motives and work. Because of the history of so many failed projects in that neighborhood, many residents are waiting for the other shoe to drop to see yet another promise broken. Next slide, please. So our work began with Market Creek Plaza, and we began with community listening to try to understand what the community really needed. And we built resident teams who planned, designed, built, leased, and just led our work in Market Creek Plaza. So you see in the picture, the before picture, the abandoned factory that was an eyesore in the community for years. No one would develop it, so we took on the challenge ourselves. And when residents came together to design the plaza, they really wanted something that truly represented the cultural diversity of the community. And you can see that both in the color and design that Market Creek Plaza is a reflection of that diversity. We found our mission as the plaza took shape, resident ownership of neighborhood change. And we developed the first ever community development IPO, which gives residents ownership of Market Creek Plaza. They have earned a full 10% return on their investment every year, and many of them are first-time investors, families, church groups, and investment circles. One proud investor was driving by Market Creek Plaza, and his young son said, "Daddy, we own that, don't we?" Sustainability is built by bringing profits back into the community through economic development, jobs, and locally owned businesses. The work on Market Creek Plaza grew to a bigger vision of community change, the village at Market Creek, and we now own over 60 acres to develop with residents, including housing, commercial, and light industrial projects. Next slide, please. This work has changed us in so many ways. We transitioned from working with nonprofits to working directly with residents. And what we're doing has never been done before. We started out as grant makers, and we've become, in order to do this work, we've become community organizers, developers, construction contractors, property managers, and so many other roles outside the definition of traditional philanthropy. Every quarter we assess our progress and determine if we need to adjust our plans. Resident work has slowed the pace of development, but it has ensured that we get it right and that the community is in the lead and not left behind. The African proverb, if you want to go quickly, go alone. If you want to go far, go together, really exemplifies our work. To sustain what happens here, we have had to have a broad range of partnerships to sustain the work beyond our sunset. We have used many different resources to accomplish our work, including grants, new market tax credits, and PRIs, and more recently, state and local monies. But the most gratifying aspect of our work is to see residents come out of their homes and take ownership of their community. We work with 9 different cultures, and all have been changed by this experience. Thank you.
Thanks, Valerie. As I said earlier, the Jakes Foundation is actually featured in Do More Than Give, and I think one of the things that we observe that is just really compelling about the approach that Valerie and her family have taken is, Leslie mentioned earlier, instead of sort of starting with how do we give grants, Jacobs Family Foundation started with, how do we solve the problem? And it's fascinating to hear you talk about all the different roles that you're playing, property manager, contractor, getting involved and launching a community development IPO, all things that, aren't traditionally or not in the purview of a traditional grant maker. But when you start with a question of how do you solve the problem, you get into a lot of the 6 practices that Leslie talked about earlier, and it really is fascinating, I think, as a catalytic philanthropist, the fact that Jacobs Family Foundation, I think, does employ pretty much all 6 practices. So we really appreciate your sharing your thoughts and your story.
Thank you so much.
Sure. We're going to go to question and answer in a bit, but I'd like to next introduce Monique Vila, who is the CEO of the Thomson Reuters Foundation. Under Monique's leadership of the Thomson Reuters Foundation, the foundation's really undergone a dramatic transformation in its approach to being much more catalytic in its philanthropy. And we're pleased that Monique could be with us to talk about that transformation. Monique, thanks for being with us.
Thanks a lot for giving me the opportunity. So the Thomson Reuters Foundation was created 3 years ago when Thomson acquired Reuters. And the Reuters Foundation was existing since at least 30 years, and it was focusing essentially on the training of journalists to expand the values of the Reuters journalism across the globe. So we train journalists in more than 100 countries in all kinds of languages on how to cover business news, as well as how to cover election, how to cover HIV/AIDS in Africa without saying too many stupidities, etc. Because we think that journalists are the ones who transmit to the others, and so the better they are prepared, and the better the democracy will be. The second program that was Reuters is the Reuters Institute for the study of journalism. It is based in Oxford, and you have there 20 fellows a year who come for 6 months, and they are all journalists mid-career from many developing countries, essentially, and they do a research, and some of them are published. The third thing of the Reuters Foundation is AlertNet. AlertNet was created immediately after the Rwanda genocide, thinking that if Reuters and NGOs that would be member of AlertNet shared more their information, we could probably avoid some of the disasters that happened in Rwanda. So this was created. When I took over the foundation 3 years ago, it was 3 separate programs. And so the first thing I did was to unite them on the same portal, and I acquired the URL trust.org, which amazingly was for free. I bought it to a shop in Texas. And on trust.org, you have now all the program of the foundation reunited. So Trust Media, we spoke of it, Trust AlertNet, and so we completely rebuilt the website of AlertNet. When I took over, there were 3 journalists. Today we have 20 journalists around the world covering humanitarian issues, that is to say, the stories that you don't read any longer in the newspapers, the Congo, the non-ending revolutions, the poverty, etc., etc. And so we covered that with journalists. We have 3 journalists. We have 3 journalists in the Americas. We have 3 in Asia. We have 2 in Africa, and we have a lot in Europe because it's in London that the core base of the foundation is established since 30 years. So that's what is AlertNet. And EIS, so AlertNet used to give grants when a disaster would strike. AlertNet would distribute grants of around $50,000 and to NGOs that would help in the immediate aftermath of the disaster. And we did that when I took over in May 2008 with the earthquake in China and just before that the cyclone in Myanmar. And what happened was that 3 months after I received letters from the grantees saying thank you very much, it was really good, you helped us doing great things, and very little metrics, very little information for me. And also, one was telling me that they bought blankets with the money, and I was thinking, this is really stupid that Thomson Reuters, which knows how to do information and how to find the information, check it, and make it reliable, finished by buying blankets. It makes no sense. So we stopped giving grants, and instead we created the Emergency Information Service, which is geared at giving, I think you can, no, I will finish on this one, on this slide, that is to give to the local population immediately after the earthquake or the tsunami, reliable information, not news, information, on what is absolutely indispensable or vital for them, like there is a hospital where surgeons can still operate, and it is there, or there is the list of missing people is in that place, the water, the distribution of water will take place here, etc. So very, very local information in the language of the affected population. We triggered it the first time in Haiti, and in Haiti we launched all that through SMS, so we will come back on that. The third program we launched with the new Trust.org is Trust Law. And you can turn the page if you want. Trust Law is something which is quite revolutionary. It's a marketplace where we give a lawyer for free to NGOs and social entrepreneurs around the world. Pro bono was very well, and is still very well organized in a handful of countries, really, and namely the US, the UK, Australia, Canada, and South Africa. In the rest of the world, pro bono is either done in a manner which is completely ad hoc, that is to say a lawyer knows an NGO and help her, or him, and either it is even forbidden, like in Germany until 2 years ago, or in Brazil still today, except in the state of Sao Paulo. So the goal was to spread the practice of pro bono worldwide. So I spent for 1 year my life on a plane, meeting law firms all around the world to convince them to be part of that network. And it is a big network of law firms and in-house legal teams of big corporations. When we launched Trust Law in July 2010, so 17 months ago, we had 180 members. And a member is a law firm. It's not the southern lawyers in the law firm. And today we have 612 at the last count that I did this afternoon, 612, among which more than 200 law firms, and law firms that have never done pro bono before, like 3 in Chinese law firms, for instance, 1 in Afghanistan, and everywhere in the world, in every country in Africa, etc. And the social entrepreneurs are vetted, so we vet the NGOs to make sure that they are not a cover for Al-Qaeda or for the mafia or for anything dodgy, because the lawyers are very careful. And for the social entrepreneurs, we have asked Ashoka, Grameen Foundation, Skoll Foundation, Schwab, all of them, to vet the social entrepreneurs for us and push them to Trust Law when they need legal counsel. Through that, very quickly, we have done a lot of very big programs. And I will speak only of a few of them. One is ADI. ADI is the biggest microfinance organization in Europe. And they asked us last year if we could make a study in the 27 countries of the EU to change the legislation on microcredit. And so we put the program on Trust Law. And immediately Latham and Watkins and Oric, which are 2 big American law firms, wanted the program. And then finally they worked together along with 17 other law firms in each country of Europe. And they produced a very big paper of research in the 27 countries on the states of legislation on microcredit. And what has happened is that ADI has been able to do their own advocacy after with the paper. They went to see the Commission in Brussels, and last Friday, 2 December, in Brussels, there was a big colloquium organized by Commissioner Barnier on how to change the legislation on microcredit. based on the research that the law firms have done. So it's a meaningful program. Another one is Transparency International has asked us if we could help them with lawyers to do their research every 4 years on the UN Convention, the UNCAC on anti-corruption. And so we have already matched them in 25 countries and soon in many others. And then on trust law, and I will go fast because I still need to speak of something else. On trust law, we cover also women's rights extensively. And coming from the conviction we have at the Foundation that we want to help women know their rights and defend their rights, because every time a woman works, a child is better fed, better educated, because she spends 80% of her salary in the family, where a man spends 35% globally of its salary in the family. So that's what we do, women's rights, anti-corruption, and pro bono. If you move to the next slide, I will quickly do what we did with the EIS in Haiti. We had organized technologies that would allow us to send mass SMS to the population, and the technology was ready 1 month before the earthquake in Haiti, so we immediately sent a team of journalists from the Foundation. They went there, and instead of covering the earthquake for the rest of the world, as all the journalists do, they went to see Médecins Sans Frontières and the UN and all the players in the immediate aftermath to find the right information that would be vital for the population and then distribute it by SMS to the population. So they secured a number which was free. After 4 days after the earthquake, we had this free number. We went to all the radios in Haiti to say, if you want to have vital information, register on this number. We immediately have more than 45,000 people who registered, and we were able to send them information, but not only that, to also receive their feedback. So this has been important, and we will trigger that every time a very big disaster strikes, and all communications are broken, because if not, we cannot make a difference. So we trigger EIS only in the most disastrous cases. And we did a very quick survey after 6 months after the earthquake. I mean, we didn't do it ourselves. We commissioned someone to do it in Haiti. And the result was pretty positive, because most of them saw that the message were very useful. And only 3% of the people interrogated said that they thought it was useless, which is very, very small, they tell me, in the polls world, because usually there are many more. So that's what we do at the Foundation. We create the big network of law firms, big network of NGOs, big networks of social entrepreneurs, and we help them work together. And we gave, the day before yesterday, the first Trust Law Awards in a ceremony in London, and all lawyers traveled from around the world for that, and it was really uplifting to see. So I hope I was not too long.
Great, thanks, Monique. I think while Thomson Reuters Foundation was not in the book as a catalytic philanthropist, I think certainly the foundation is very similar to Jacobs Family Foundation. It's great to see, and I think something that defines catalytic philanthropists is, instead of saying, how do we give out grants, you start with what's the problem we want to solve. And I think importantly with Thomson Reuters Foundation, taking advantage of the assets you could bring and sort of legal expertise and information, and thinking about networks, not even just networks of nonprofits, but in the case of your initiatives, thinking about networks of businesses, for instance, in terms of spreading the practice of pro bono worldwide. Just really, really interesting stuff, so thanks for sharing that.
Thanks.
I'd like to now turn the conversation over to Paul Brest to react to what he's heard from so far today. I'm sure many people on the webinar have heard of Paul or know Paul, but for those who haven't, Paul is the longtime president of the Hewlett Foundation in California. He's also one of the most prolific speakers and writers and advocates on the topic of impact-focused philanthropy. Many may have read Paul's most recent book, published in 2008, Money Well Spent, A Strategic Plan for Smart Philanthropy. Paul, what strikes you in what you've heard so far in these two stories of catalytic philanthropy and in Leslie's opening framing on the concepts in Do More Than Give?
Well, I had not planned to do anything along the lines of a presentation, but I think since we are of the three speakers, I think I'm the only representative of a grant-making foundation. I think it might be useful to just say a bit about how a grant-making foundation is different from an operating foundation, which I think both Valerie and Monique represent. So, I mean, first of all, what we all share in common, and this is a key aspect of your book, is whether you call it outcome-oriented or strategic philanthropy or problem-solving philanthropy, it has these elements that the philanthropist, whether it's a grant-making or a operating foundation, has clear goals. It develops strategies. Now, in our case, because we are a grant-making foundation, the strategies are developed together with grantees. They're not developed internally. Strategies for a grant maker will only be successful if they are owned by the grantees. And then what's critically important, and I hear this in both of the presentations so far, is that we and our grantees track progress toward the goals. When you have goals, you have strategies to achieve them, and then you need to know how you're doing. You need to know how you're doing because you need to correct course if you are not on course. All of the work, all catalytic philanthropy, and I think this is true of what you've heard from Monique and Valerie, requires a high degree of risk tolerance. And there's nothing wrong with doing non-catalytic philanthropy, with having good organizations that are providing services to needy people, to the homeless, and simply supporting them day in and day out. But that requires relatively little risk tolerance if the organization is established. All catalytic philanthropy requires a lot of risk, as you heard explicitly from Leslie, and I think implicitly from Monique. You can have some of these programs and they just won't work. What justifies taking the risk is the potential for really high impact, and it's all about impact. So just to give you a sense of how a grant-making foundation might think of these issues, here are several things that we do. We are involved in field building, in situations where there really is no single organization that's capable of solving a whole problem, where you need to seed a lot of organizations at the same time. We did this in the alternative dispute resolution area and withdrew because we thought the field was pretty well developed. We've done it with open educational resources, and we're currently doing this with education in developing countries, trying to change both the goals and the practice toward those goals for actual learning results rather than how many kids are attending schools. So that's one aspect of catalytic philanthropy. Another, I'll just take one other and then maybe stop, is advocacy. We ourselves, for reasons that were alluded to, do not do advocacy, but the Internal Revenue Code permits supporting organizations that do a great deal of advocacy. And to just give two examples, I think are in a strategy co-developed with grantees. We've worked to reduce diesel and other pollution in the Central Valley and in the Los Angeles ports, a real success that led to policy change. And then the area where actually the single largest amount of our grant making goes into trying to reduce climate change. And that, too, depends very strongly on advocacy in the U.S. and other countries. And just to end this, to emphasize the issue of risk, and not all foundations have the same appetite or tolerance for risk. Two of the biggest investments or two of the biggest advocacy efforts of our grantees over the last 2 years were abysmal failures. One was the attempt by some organizations to get a congressional cap on CO2 emissions, and the other was the attempt to get an agreement in Copenhagen among many countries. Now, the second one may have some, I don't want to be too optimistic about that, so I'll just call them failures. And so what justifies putting huge amounts of money into a catalytic effort that may fail? What justifies it is the huge impact if it succeeds. So I guess the last point I want to make, and this is certainly true for the operating foundations, even as much as, if not more so for us, you can't do this without staff. If an individual donor wants to do this kind of work, then he or she either has to be willing to put funds into building a staff, or else find a other foundation or organization who he or she has tremendous confidence in, and follow them, in effect. But people who have their own money tend not to want to follow other people. That seems for better or worse. So it's not for people who don't have risk appetite, and not for people who are not willing to put some sort of funding into staff. And I guess the last point I want to make is an issue raised at the very beginning, I think, is how do you deal with administrative costs as compared to grant-making costs? How much money out the door versus administrative costs? There's a very simple answer to that. What you're ultimately trying to do is maximize your impact, and the only justification, but it can sometimes be a very strong justification for staffing up, is that you believe with reason that having a staff will increase your impact more than simply shoveling the money out the door. Why don't I stop there?
Well, those are a great set of thoughts, and there's a lot to pick up on in there, and a lot of what you mentioned, I think, echoes many of the questions that we're getting in. I'm maybe going to start with your point, and this is really something that I'd love to hear Valerie and Monique's perspective on, that, it is, you really can't do catalytic philanthropy unless you invest in staff and, folks who are going to have the time to devote to this. And I think both Valerie and Monique, you described your organizations initially as, doing more grants, and then, shifting into this catalytic mode and, thinking differently about how you invest. And, Paul's just suggested that when you think about sort of administrative versus what's, programmatic investment, that at the end of the day, it's creating impact that counts. But curious how, if there was pushback as you thought about, or, even sort of a lot of uncertainty as you thought about sort of transitioning your organizations. How did you think about this, sort of the balance of grant making versus sort of assets and skills that you all could bring to the picture?
Shall I answer, Monique?
Yep, go ahead.
Yeah, for me, it has been very easy. I've been so disappointed by the lack of metrics that the Reuters Foundation had on what was done with the grants we gave, that I thought, it just doesn't make sense. So we have so many capacities. I mean, it's very easy it has been relatively easy, let's say, for me to leverage all the corporate assets we have in Thomson Reuters. So, you have the journalists and the news and the infrastructure, etc. But you also have, with Westlaw, the databases and the help of lawyers. And so I have not received even pushback from the NGOs which were used to receive the grants, because the EIS has imposed himself completely like something that could really fill a gap in the information chain that even the UN was recognizing. That is to say that when a disaster struck, you had all the media from the world coming to cover the story for the rest of the world, all the humanitarian machine coming to cover, to try to organize the help in total chaos, and nobody having time to focus on informing the local population. So more or less, immediately the UN has seen that what we were proposing was really filling a gap. So I had absolutely no pushback. And regarding trust law, neither, because it didn't exist. You had some organizations that organize a little bit the pro bono internationally, etc., but nothing that is totally global and that can, with the news and the database and all we bring on the table, have the impact that we have had very quickly with trust law.
That's great. Valerie, how did your family think about that transition?
Well, I think our basic feeling at first was we wanted to find out what was really going on in these low-income communities, and the way we needed to find that out was to listen. And so we began working directly with residents, and residents are involved in all decision-making in our philanthropy. And in order for us to do that directly with residents, we needed a staff to help us listen and to focus on the different areas of the community needs and issues. So we started by giving grants like all other family foundations and slowly transitioned to an operating foundation where we work directly with residents, and we feel that we do our best to listen and to act on the desires of the community to improve their own neighborhoods.
That's really helpful. Thanks. You know, there are a lot of questions that have come in about how one evaluates catalytic philanthropic efforts, and perhaps for Paul and Leslie and any others of our panelists, you know, one sort of window into this, one webinar attendee suggests and asks the question, how do we evaluate one of our own catalytic initiatives when that's focused on policy change at the state and federal level? And, you know, we're not the only ones involved in this. There are other organizations and other foundations that are also engaged in parallel efforts. How do we think about our unique contribution in terms of value add? Paul, Leslie, others, thoughts on that?
Well, I mean, the most important time to evaluate your contribution to an advocacy effort is when you are developing the strategy, and as much as possible you're going to be developing it in collaboration with allies, but there are always exogenous forces that you know, may have huge effects. But the reason for evaluating a strategy is not to look back later and take credit or kind of look unhappy. It's to learn as you're going and to improve the strategy. And there are, you know, there's a really quite interesting, I think a little bit more pessimistic article than my own view in the Stanford Social Innovation Review by Stephen Tellez and a collaborator on evaluating advocacy. And there are ways, I think one can go even further than they did, in suggesting ways that you can know whether you are on track, whether you're doing the right things. But ultimately, advocacy is a very nonlinear, discontinuous function. So you have to kind of look at how you're doing pretty often.
Right.
Can I jump in?
Sure, go ahead.
Yeah, on the evaluation, because it's absolutely crucial for me, and I have many systems and metrics, etc. Obviously, the one which is very easy, for instance, with trust law, is to ask the lawyers that have worked on the program how much money it cost them, because they know exactly that 1 hour cost them that amount. So we have that very, it's very clear. What is much more difficult to evaluate, and I've still not found the right solution, and I would be interested to hear your ideas, is on the beneficiary side. Because it's very, for an NGO that receives, a lawyer that gives him very good advice on an IP problem or on an HR problem, etc., you can probably quantify. But when you start to do these very big programs like the one with Transparency International, or with changing the microcredit in Europe, or one we do on Haiti, which is how do you put an end to the impunity on rape, and 6 law firms have worked on that from 6 different countries, then it is very difficult to see the impact and to calculate it. So if you have ideas, I would be very interested.
Great, thanks. Well, maybe one more question on evaluation, because there are so many that are coming through. One question that sort of states that, evaluation costs money, and, Albert Einstein once said, not everything that can be counted counts, and not everything that counts can be counted. So how do you think about what it is that you evaluate?
So let me try that. First of all, 2 points. One, evaluation is a cost, just like every other cost of operations is a cost, and is justified to the extent that you think that knowing the answer to the evaluation question is going to ultimately improve impact. That is, it's going to make you do a better job, change course when it needs to be changed, and that the amount of impact from improving your practice is worth more than the cost of the evaluation. And secondly, the Einstein quote, notice he says not everything, but if you look at Einstein's history, you think a huge amount of what he did was quantified indeed. Right now there are some very contested questions about whether some of his quantifications were right.
Right, great. Thanks. Well, Leslie, maybe I'm going to throw this question to you, and I'm happy to help out. A number of questions have come in about, particularly if, a donor or foundation is on a relative scale, smaller, not as large as the Hewlett Foundation. Can a comparatively small family foundation with several $1 million to give, or a smaller community foundation, can they truly be catalytic, or is this just, for the large people?
Well, I think the short answer is yes. Whether you're as big as Hewlett or the Gates Foundation or a relatively modest family foundation like the ones we write about in Do More Than Give, catalytic philanthropy is what lets you punch above your weight, so you can have a big impact whether you're relatively large or small. Now, just one point about advocacy, which Paul so eloquently spoke to in terms of being able to measure the effectiveness. The first hurdle for many donors, especially smaller ones, is, foundations and even individuals tend to shy away from supporting advocacy, whether it's because, it's just not as fulfilling as giving a direct service grant and seeing somebody go to a better school or be clothed and fed. And yet the potential systemic change that can result from advocacy is enormous. And so it goes back to this thing about risk. If you're a relatively small foundation, for instance, the Tao Foundation is one that we write about in the book, and also the Jacobs family. Let me use that example. Valerie alluded to the fact that in the Diamonds neighborhood, they created the first community IPO. Well, how did Jacobs Family Foundation do that? For 6 years, they worked through networks to advocate to change policy in the state of California, and if anybody's tried to do policy change in California, you know how fun that can be, so that they could create a new policy that enabled relatively low-income people to buy stock in this enterprise. Most of the people who own Market Creek Plaza from the local residencies are first-time stock owners. They had to change policy in order to make that happen and take the risk, use the political chips. And that's the things that donors have that most often nonprofits don't. Robert Eggers, who many on this call probably know, social activist and anti-hunger campaigner, talks about nonprofits want to affect change, but when it comes to access to policymakers and changing policy, many times we're just spitting in the wind. Whereas donors, because of their wealth, their influence, their connections, their clout, if they're willing to play those chips, that's where they can make a bigger difference. And that's what we mean by leverage. So if you're smaller, if you're willing to not just put the dollars out there, but make the calls, be part of pushing for policy change, then you can get to those systemic answers. So that's one aspect. And another question that came up was what if you're a small business? 80% of the corporate sector are these small businesses, not big global companies like Thomson Reuters. The key, again, is looking at, okay, how do you don't just define your assets as your annual grant-making budget, but what are all the assets of the company, your presence in the community? We write in the book about PNC, a bank. They trained their regional bank presidents on how to advocate using their lobbying power, not to advocate for better banking regulations, but in this case on behalf of early childhood reforms as part of their Grow Up Great program. So yes, they made grants and they used this non-financial asset. So it goes back to this point about look at all the things you can leverage, even if you don't have a ton of money, to advance causes. And often for those in the nonprofit world, those are very valuable resources that they don't have access to.
Great. Well, those are some great thoughts. Thank you. There are a number of questions that have come in about, catalytic philanthropy, sort of being proactive, being initiated by the foundation. Again, a number of different lenses into this. But Valerie, I might actually direct this to you. The question is, what happens when a foundation's vision of change is different than the community's? My sense is that's something you actually did experience. I'd be curious of your thoughts.
Yes. Everybody has their ideas of what's going to make their community better, and many of those ideas were based around the past and what groups were most active and vocal in the community. And we started in the community by knocking on doors, literally knocking on doors and asking residents what they wanted to see in their community. And we started gathering small groups, living room meetings, we called them, and had neighborhoods residents invite their neighbors to their homes for discussion groups. And we've gotten to the point where we have quarterly village community meetings where we invite everybody that we can and it's open to anyone in the community to come and to discuss our work and to report to the community, as well as get their ideas and wisdom, as well as the working teams that are involved with us on a regular basis. So I think one of the unintended consequences of kind of going in low to the ground rather than going to the anointed leaders of the community was that we got a lot of backlash from certain cultural groups who felt slighted that we didn't come to them since they were the leaders in the community. We kind of started on the ground. And we've worked hard to bring them in as well to help us with our work.
Yeah, I think that's just such a great approach that the foundation has taken, and what I love about it is the last practice that we talk about in the 6 practices is learn in order to change, and creating that very frequent feedback loop. Paul talked about that as well, that you have to reach out and get feedback on a fairly regular basis. Is something that typically is not done, and catalytic philanthropists and SPADE do that. And when you do create that sort of feedback loop, then you do get to where you get on the same page with your constituencies as opposed to where you might have started, which might have been something different. And in fact, Valerie, I think you even talked about how changed you all have been through this process, and that's something that we've typically observed. Well, we're coming up to the top of the hour, and so I'd like to thank everybody who's tuned in for joining us, and particularly our panelists for their thoughtful stories and observations. And before we bring the conversation to a close, I'd just like to share some brief concluding thoughts as those of you that are on the phone think about how you might actually do more than give. And the first is this, that catalytic philanthropy may sound daunting, but it's not an all-or-nothing proposition. The basic idea is simple. If you want to increase the impact of your grants, you need to do more than give. As a funder, we think you have a unique role to play in catalyzing change, and it doesn't mean that you need to do the work of the nonprofit. Some people asked, are you basically talking about sort of replacing the work of the nonprofit? The answer is no, but you can complement your partner grantees in their efforts of leveraging change in ways that you can really create more powerful results than either you as a foundation or your nonprofit partners could do working alone. And in the appendix of the book, Do More Than Give, we actually offer a set of activities within each practice area that are organized by 2 levels of difficulty. So for those of you that feel like you're more beginners in catalytic philanthropy, there's a set of activities under each of the practices that might pertain more to you. And if you're more experienced in these practices but are looking for sort of new ideas, we have a list of activities that might pertain to you. So that's the first thought. It's not an all-or-nothing proposition. The second thought is this, that being a catalytic philanthropist, while it's not for the faint of heart, we suspect that many of you who move in this direction will find that the extra blood, sweat, and tears will be worth it. You know, traditional philanthropy can sometimes be viewed as a spectator sport. You write the check and you send it off and you watch while others play the game. What we're suggesting through Do More Than Give and through many of the stories and observations that you heard today is that you get into the game. It's a lot more intense when you're in the game than it is to be watching it, but we think based on our research, our conversations with catalytic donors like those you heard from today, and in our consulting, we think you'll find that taking a catalytic approach to your philanthropy is much more rewarding than merely giving away money. We fervently believe that the world would and can be a better place if more donors adopted the tools of catalytic philanthropy, and we hope that all of you, whether you're more of a beginner to these practices or more experienced, will keep working to up your game and improve your ability to have an impact. So thanks to everyone for being with us today, and have a great rest of the day, everyone. Take care.